Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Michael Rapici, how are you this evening?
Dr. Barry Falk, I'm doing very well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited, if not full of beans. I don't know if we're approaching the B level here, but I'm certainly excited to be with you again to talk. This is our 51st episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a special occasion still. And we're going to be talking about a recent New York Times op-ed piece by Denise Lu, who's a visual, let me get the exact title of her position. She is a visual journalist at Bloomberg News. She has a very distinguished resume. She's also worked for the New York Times and for the Washington Post. The name of her op-ed is "Want to Enjoy Music More? Our Interest has Peaked. Want to enjoy music more? Stop streaming it," unquote. I'll read the subtitle.
Please.
Yeah. Build a real music collection. Reintroduce intimacy to the ones you love.
The songs you care about.
Reintroduce intimacy to the songs you care about. All right. And I guess this article by Denise Lu had our attention as soon as we saw that "stop streaming it." We thought,
why would you do that?
Why would you do that? And could this be a suitable material for Critical Media Studies podcasts? And we thought, yes, it could.
Absolutely.
Yes, it could. So I think I'm going to hand this over to the able Dr. Michael Rapici in just a moment, but I'll say one more thing about it. So we're going to try to translate. We're going to try and talk about the issues that Denise Lu raises. As we do so, I think we'll try to make an effort to translate some of her terms into terms that get bandied about on this podcast, and that our listeners, if you're a frequent listener, you're going to recognize the vocabulary in which we're trying to transpose or translate Denise Lu's ideas into, because we think there's a way in which this argument or her predicament, maybe this way, maybe a better way of saying it is that there's a way in which her predicament, her self-proclaimed predicament of her disquiet or unease with using streaming technologies in order to process or the platforms for streaming somehow are doing an injustice or doing damage to her appreciation of music, to her enjoyment of music. That's one of our themes, is what is technology doing to us? So in that spirit, we're going to think about Denise Lu.
I think that I just want to add one thing to that. We started the discussion this evening by saying, well, is this something we should talk about? And I think that is the aim of this discussion, is to say, what does her position look like when we run it through, in this case,
our
most likely
grids,
Bernard Stiegler, right? So we're going to talk about this, and it's all the usual suspects. I suspect that we will hit on our what have become our canonical fathers here, right? But the idea here is that we're going to look at how her position fits in with the sort of theoretical bedrock of the things we've been working on.
You said it so much more adequately and eloquently than I did. So I'm ready to pass this on to you.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not a long piece. It's short, and I will put a link to this article in the notes for the podcast in the show notes. It's too long to read the whole thing, but I think that we really want to try and get the gist of her entire argument. So what I'm going to do is just read a little snippet from each paragraph, which I think outlines her basic position.
Okay, so, ground rules, Dr. Rapici. Ground rules. As you do this, do we want to talk about it or no?
I think
do all the reading together.
Yeah, here. let me just say, hey, here's the argument, and then we can go. Otherwise,
I like it.
God knows where we'll go. Okay.
Got it.
So again, it's entitled Want to Enjoy Music More, Stop Streaming It, Build a Real Music Collection, Reintroduce Intimacy to the Songs You Care About. So she says, the only music streaming account I've ever had lasted less than 72 hours in 2012. She says in 23, I'm still building a non-streaming music collection. Fine. She says that she came along. She says that she came along before Spotify took over the market, and that she belongs to what is probably the last generation to remember what it was like to own a music collection that doesn't live in the cloud. She says that she says she does not like how streaming feels, and that's feels is italicized, like I'm only borrowing something for a while rather than having a hand-picked library of albums, digital or physical, that I've vetted and can keep forever. So then she moves on and talks about how she was using iTunes in 2019. And she says, I have several libraries across different devices and drives that, much to my dismay, all differ from one another slightly. What I lack in portability, I make up for in security once I add something to my iTunes library. I have it forever. I have no fear of platforms removing artists or of artists removing themselves. She says that she started the journey in grade school, and like her peers, she got around. I got around the new order via dubious means, importing CDs that she found at the library, downloading MP3s online, sharing files, and browsing state. She says she worked as DJ at a music station at her college radio station, shared files, browsed the station's racks for CDs we could rip to fatten up our iTunes libraries. She moves on to say that she now pays for nearly all her music. She talks a bit about Bandcamp being her platform of choice for MP3s because it is most beneficial to the artists. She says, if something isn't available on Bandcamp, I'll scope out used CDs to buy and rip. If I love something enough, I'll try to get the record. If it's out of print, I'll throw it on my wish list and cross my fingers for a reissue. Goes on to say, and we're almost finished here, goes on to say that this isn't convenient. Depriving myself of streaming means there's no easy way for me to repeatedly listen to a song without a deeper monetary commitment. But for me, listening to music is not about convenience so much as engagement. Resisting Spotify pushes me to actively find new music as opposed to sitting through Discover weekly playlists generated by an algorithm. Tune into stations and go down the rabbit holes on YouTube, whose algorithm can still surprise me as long as I give it the right seeds. She finishes by saying the process of discovery has created a stash of albums that is dwarfed by Spotify's bloated world of curated playlists and anarchic algorithm radio stations. I prefer it that way. When everyone has access to everything, nothing is stamped with the personal memories, the particulars that hold our experience of music together. I don't need the entirety of the recorded music at my fingertips. I just need the few curated albums that I cared enough about to collect. Having my own library means I can distinctly remember the context of every find, and that makes my intimacy with the songs I care about feel rich. So that, I think, is a fair summary of her argument. So just said very briefly, she's never been into streaming. She says that it feels like borrowing as opposed to ownership, and ownership for her has some connection to memory, and there's the value. So the argument that she makes about intimacy, Barry, correct me if you see this differently. Let's revisit the title. Want to enjoy music more, stop streaming it, build a real music collection. Real for her is synonymous with ownership, and ownership allows for intimacy in a way that streaming does not.
Yes. And I want to return to two terms, or two of the sentences, terms that I noticed in two of the key sentences in her the concluding portion of the essay. So there seemed to be set of oppositions that Lu is working with, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the oppositions is, as you pointed out, ownership.
Right.
I'm sorry, borrowing. And then there's this idea of ownership. And it seems that only on the ownership side, if you're doing more than borrowing the music, which that's how she redefines streaming music, that unless you stop borrowing and have some sort of ownership over the music, you cannot truly engage with music. So let me just reread briefly a part of the sentence that you read. For me, listening to music is not about convenience, which it is in the borrowing world, in the world of streaming where you're borrowing music.
Right. So
But
streaming
it is about engagement. So is something you wanted to say there?
No, go
Because I
ahead.
had a question for you right
Go ahead.
there. So maybe maybe we could stop right here before we do anything else. Let's see if we can sort of puzzle out together or think through together this binary and what we think of this binary, that borrowing only allows for you to, what's the word? Convenience. Borrowing is basically functionalizing music or
Right.
instrumentalizing music and instrumentalizing music for your convenience. And the counter to that is what she's proposing, which is you're engaging with music by collecting it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
usually collecting kind of shades into owning permanent copies of whatever you engage.
right.
So
So
what are your
go ahead.
comments on, no, that was it. I was just, do you like that sort of, do you think I got it right?
I think you have
The
it right.
binary?
I
Yeah.
have questions about this.
Okay.
And
But this is what we want to discuss.
okay, so I want to just lay some ground rules here because this is something that's not right. It's not that I want to lay ground. I want to sort of self-disclose a few things and just make a few things clear about the way that I'm approaching this. Yes. Here
We're
we
like,
go.
how much are we in? Are we 10 minutes in? Or are we 15 minutes in where you have the self-disclosure?
Barry,
This is
we
problematic.
are all the way in. Here we go.
Ouch.
I approach this idea. So first of all, to me, the core of this is this thing about intimacy or engagement.
Engagement.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's the core of her argument. And I think that for, most all of us who have just, cozied up to a particular song or a particular album or something have established a real connection,
Intimate connection with this
music. This resonates. This is real. Okay. So I think that what she's talking about is significant and important, but I also think that there's a big gap between where she's coming from and where I'm coming from. And then just out of necessity, even more so where you're coming from here. Right. And that is that she's younger than we are. And she says that, there's no mention here of the physical artifact other than buying a used CD to instantly rip it. Okay. She talks briefly about if she really, really loves something, she'll wait for the record. Right. If I love something enough, I'll try and get the record if it's out of print. So there is a nod to the physical artifact for her, but in a way, it's too early to bring in Adorno at this point. I'm gonna back away. I'm gonna say that I feel like she's coming at this as a digital native who grew up and just understood and established her relationship with music in digital formats. Right. That's I came alive. My first albums were on vinyl because that's what it was. There were no CDs. Right. I am one of those kids who rewound tapes by sticking it over a pencil and spinning it around because that was how you did it because something else was playing. So there's a tension for me already with her demonization of, she's not demonizing streaming for her
Well, but
preference.
she is doing a binary, right? That's what I was trying to set up at the
I
front,
struggle
right?
to
An
understand.
opposition, an
Yes.
opposition.
So for her, engagement and convenience are at odds. Okay.
Very pithy put.
That's the tension here. And I'm looking at this, and the irony for me is that music, in the way that she seems to own it and engage with it, is digital, which, if we're talking about convenience, is infinitely more convenient than what you and I likely went through. I had to get up and run across the room and find the record in a stack. I had to go search through my car to find a cassette tape, not sure where it was. You'd open up the case for the tape and it wasn't there, or the wrong tape was in the wrong case. You know, there was a total lack of convenience. Now, to this point, I want to say that I'm doing the same thing she's saying. I am romanticizing the frustration or the chore, the inconvenience of listening to music. So I get what she's saying, but from my perch, I struggle, and I'm gonna toss this back to you, because I think that you are more level-headed than I am when it comes to these things, perhaps more tempered.
Hardly, but
I struggle to see the distinction that would result in some sort of intimacy. I don't understand how you create intimacy without the physical artifact.
So before this episode even began, Michael and I were talking about, things we wanted to bring up in relation to this argument. And I said, I wanted to sort of talk through the article, the short op-ed, using some of the terminologies that Bernard Stiegler uses. But before I do that, I'm fascinated. I kind of want to return to your discussion thread, the discussion thread you just created, Michael. And I had a non-rhetorical question, in the sense that I don't know the answer of it, and I kind of want to think through it with you.
Okay.
Do you think, let's divorce Lu's framework from some of Lu's own personal narrative?
Okay.
Let's just think of one of the arguments that she makes in isolation from, she gives a lot of her biographical history. By the way, I have to say this. I am very much on Lu's side, because she, like me, got suckered by the dirty projectors, and she bought that god-awful double disc set. She must have bought it as a double disc. And she regrets it now. And so I have to say, I'm automatically on Denise Lu's side.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm not oppositional. I'm just, thanks, Barry. I like her. What's your problem?
No. Actually, here was my point. I got off on the dirty projectors point, and I obscured my own point. My point is that this essay is full of a lot of interesting, to me, personal reflections about her own personal encounter, history with music. But I wanted us to talk about, and I just was still pondering a question that you raised, like, divorce it from what Lu says and Lu's personal history and her anecdotes. Do you think there's something to that argument that convenience is detrimental to intimacy?
I do. And I also, and I'm going to come right back to it, but I want to say I want to just back up for 1 second.
Of course.
I think that there's a larger question here that I want to see if we can come back around to at the end. Okay. So the question about convenience and intimacy, I'm going to get to in a second. But the question I think that I want to look at here, and I think we're only going to be able to look at it at the end, is whether or not a lack of physicality portends I don't want to say it, whether or not a lack of physicality is going to be detrimental to our ability to feel intimacy, because
Michael, yeah,
that's a significant question. Like, I'm suspecting here now, and I don't know, again, I could be the cranky old man who just wants everybody off my lawn, right?
I'm
But
trying to get our discussion out of the generational matrix, in the sense that, as you know, as you already stated, we're both older than her.
yeah.
And so I'm trying to lift, and me, a hell of a lot older than her. So I'm trying to lift these ideas outside of that generational matrix, because I think if we get in there, we're not going to do her justice or our
No,
justice.
that's fair. But that's something that that's a question I do want to look at the end. But to your point, to your question about whether or not, whether or not convenience.
Well, let me actually, rather than restate it, I actually think you got to the nub of my question, which you said, actually, Michael, I'm going to ask that we talk about not this question at the end, not at the end, but right now, because I feel that you reframed and reformulated my question better than my question. I think what I was asking you was precisely what you said I want to talk about at the end, but no. I want you to talk about it now, because that is, I think, the central nub of this argument. Detaching it from our matrix, detaching these arguments from our matrix, our own particular experience of music, which was tied toward our age, and her experience of music, which is tied to her age. What do we think about the general proposition that unless things have a material manifestation, including music, right? Now, it's tricky with music because obviously music is immaterial. Nonetheless, music has tons of material manifestations. And I think the question I'm rolling over in my head, and that's kind of central to Lu, and we can take from Lu, is the question, you framed it well, just like, what do we think of the general proposition that if you detach music entirely from material accoutrements, it is no longer something we can retain, and therefore we can't get intimate with? I'm fascinated by that metaphor of intimacy. Like, what does it mean to be intimate with music? It just means, what does that even mean? I think that means you have an association of music with a material thing. And let me just, I'm going to pose the question to you, but maybe it will be helpful to you and to everybody if I give you my sort of first answer to it.
Yeah.
I do think, and until you argue me out of it, and you could, because I'm spitballing here, I do think that she has her finger on something really important, and that really what is worrying her, because you had already mentioned this, and you read this part of the article to the readers. There's a weirdness. I won't call it a contradiction, but there's certainly something kind of odd in that Lu says, I don't like the Spotify algorithm, but on the other hand, she says,
I'm good with the YouTube algorithm.
I totally dig the YouTube algorithm. Okay, so I wonder if the algorithm is really what's at stake here. I wonder if what's really bothering her and us, or if it's worth everybody to get bothered about, I guess that's what I'm asking you, is the primary question of, do you need a material object of a third person proxy, but the person is not a person, it's an object. Do you need an object proxy to mediate, to create intimacy with music?
Okay. So first of all, I think my simple answer to this is a resounding, emphatic no. Okay. You don't. Okay. And if you think about it, there are all sorts of songs that I love, and when I hear them, bring me to a particular place or a particular moment that I've never owned, that I've just heard on the radio, or I've heard in.
Really? That's interesting.
So you go about that. you think about one of the, I think, most powerful examples of this is the live performance, right? You walk in, you see a show, you have your mind blown and your spirit moved, and you walk out and you just have that moment, that memory of this, right? Like there's no artifact to it. So no, I don't think that you need any sort of physical artifact to have intimacy. You simply need a moment. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this, so in that way, her argument fits perfect. I have no issue with this. I think she's on to something here in the fact that we can have an intimate relationship with music that we don't own.
So I think we've also gone at the core. Can I say something without, and this is absolutely not disagreeing with you. It sounds like I'm disagreeing with you, and I'm absolutely not disagreeing with you because you know how I'm not disagreeing with you? Because I agree with you. What you just said about the live performance.
Okay.
What you just said about live performance and how that's a real memory.
Mm-hmm.
How could I disagree with that? I totally agree with it.
Yeah,
But
because you've had your
still,
doors
Michael,
blown off before.
yeah, yeah. But still, I would answer the same question, that I asked you. I would answer no. And even the example of live performance, where, like I said, I'm consonant with you. I'm with you. But here's the thing. And maybe this is just a function of maybe generations are coming back into it here, because it's one of the things that frustrates me about live shows is that my memory of live shows has very little content. I am not one of those, and maybe this just points to a subjective personal deficiency, but even the shows that I love, 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 I try to retain the details,
That is
but I
not
don't.
that is not a contradiction. That fits this, because we're talking about intimacy here. Okay.
Yeah.
Intimacy, as I think she's talking about it, certainly as I'm talking about it, is not about a record of what happened. It's about an emotional response to
Emotional
something.
affect. It's about
Okay.
affect.
And I'll
Yeah,
give you
yeah,
a
yeah.
perfect example. So
Okay.
a couple months ago, my wife and I went and saw one of the greatest rock and roll band, one of the greatest American rock and roll bands currently making music. We went and saw the Drive-By Truckers, and you've seen them. Yeah.
I have.
Okay. It is just an absolute sonic onslaught.
They're
I
a
mean,
rock. They're a rock band.
it is the rock show. And Kat's not a big Truckers fan. She's incredibly accommodating to my music, right? Much more so than I am to her. She's like, let's go see a show. Okay, fine. So we go see a show. So we go in. She doesn't know any of the music at all, right? Like she hasn't heard any of it. We come out and she just looks at me and she's like, that was awesome, right? That was absolutely awesome. And we've talked about it a few times since, like, that was a good show. That was a great show. So there's this connection she has, right, with something that she doesn't know. It's just a moment.
And she
Okay.
can have granular details. Yeah,
How many
yeah,
times you've been like, oh, song comes on the radio when we listened to radio and like, oh, I love this song. I don't know any of it. And I've got all the words wrong. How many people sing the words wrong? Okay. So it's not about knowing or having an accurate record of something. It's about having an emotional response to something. And I don't think that the accuracy or fidelity of that response to the original, right, to the actual source material matters one bit, because ultimately intimacy is a personal thing. So I'm good. I don't think what you said complicates my position. I don't think we need that. My question for you, and this is something I just don't understand, okay, is that what is the distinction? And this is where ownership becomes relevant here. What is the distinction between listening to music that is streamed and listening to music that you technically own as a series of ones and zeros on electronic devices? So if
But the alternative to,
what's
I'm
the
sorry, say
difference
it again.
between the
Was it
music? What's the difference between the music in my
music you
iTunes library
stream?
and
Yeah.
the music I stream?
Hmm.
And how does that difference matter in terms of intimacy? That's what I cannot figure out about this. I don't understand. And she's like, I don't like how streaming feels like I'm borrowing something.
Right.
To me, if I say, okay, you're borrowing something, but it's akin to like borrowing something from somebody and say, I'll get this back to you soon. And they say, look, hold on to it for as long as you'd like. Right? Sure, I don't own it in the sense that I don't have any sort of legal right to this, but I've got it as long as I want it.
Okay. Well, so now I think I'm in the structural position of doing the defense of Lou. So I'm going to do that in two ways. I'm going to do that in two respects.
Who I want to make clear is not under attack. I'm just trying to
Who
understand.
is so not under attack.
Okay.
And my defense is not a defense against your attack. How about that?
That's good. I like
That's
it.
what I want to say.
Even
though I use that word defense, it's hyperbole because you're not attacking. So there's that. But I have two comments to make. Or rather, I'm going to try to reformulate some of her concerns. And you tell me whether you think it's a just reformulation, if you think I'm off the mark, things like that. But that's actually what I'm doing. Rather than defending, I'm going to try to translate or reformulate some of what I think are her key concerns. So let me do the first one. And I suppose this transposition amounts to a little bit of a defense in this. You're talking about borrowing, the way you just described it a moment ago, Michael. You're talking about music. Okay, I borrowed the Yes album or Close to the Edge from Spotify. Now, as you point out, in most cases, it's kind of weird to use the word borrow from that because Yes gave their music to Spotify.
Right.
Until there's some sort of weird contractual obligation or until all the members start talking, stuff against COVID vaccines, chances are, go totally right wing on this, chances are that borrow is going to last a long time. But I guess this is a bit of a question for you. But you and I know that she's not totally wrong. I mean, her fears about borrowing are not totally groundless. I dare say for most of the music that she is listening to, including her hated dirty projectors, it's a stretch to call that borrowing, that you're borrowing it on Spotify, because barring nuclear attacks or, like I said, dirty projectors going on Joe Rogan.
Well, it's also
the borrow is sempiternal. So, but things do get pulled. Once you're talking, and there is an echelon of music that either A, never gets on Spotify, or once pulled, never comes back.
That's right. But
so she has a concern, right? I mean, isn't that behind her fear?
Yeah, but
her anxiety?
Maybe, but what are the odds that music is going to get pulled from Spotify, removed from YouTube, and then also obliterated or otherwise just completely removed from any other sort of place that she might stream it? Are those odds really any better than her deleting it from her phone by accident?
Her deleting it by her phone. No, very good point. You know what I'm thinking? Tell me if you agree with this. As I was making this defensive argument, I'm wondering whether or not music is a bad example. That the real example that would be where borrowing, I could think in the visual realm, in terms of film or television programs.
Probably
I think in visual content, I think her argument about borrowing would have a lot of weight.
Let me say this, though. her focus again is on intimacy, and there is a specific and special intimacy with music that,
Sure.
speaking for myself, I don't have. Now, I will say though, recently I have come into a situation where I bought an
Excuse me.
album because I could not get it anywhere else. It wasn't on Spotify. It wasn't anywhere else. So she's not wrong. This is a thing that it's happened to me in the past month, but it's happened to me once in the past month. It's also happened to me once in the past like 10 years.
10 years, right, right.
So does that inability to get that one thing really mean streaming is a block to intimacy? I don't see that. And I don't, but again, I just don't see the difference. I'm hoping that we can use some sort of, because maybe, here we go. Let's invoke our friend Marshall McLuhan. Is the medium the message here? Is this simply a case of, because she's concerned with Bandcamp, she's concerned with the musicians getting paid, and somehow that means that Spotify doesn't adequately compensate the musicians for their work, and therefore the algorithm is dirty. But if that's the case, how is YouTube okay?
Right, right. Well, I think to be fair to you, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think to be fair to you, to Lou, and she doesn't have time to write a link, so some of the arguments get a little bit clotted, and there are a couple arguments actually here, as you pointed out. There's an ethical argument against the algorithm that seems to be, at some point she makes ethical arguments against streaming, and that at other point and sort of invokes this idea of a more ethical or equitable mode of consumption and production. And sometimes that gets a little bit conflated with the other arguments. So, I'm glad you brought that up. So, okay. Was there another thing you want to bring up? I'll do my second transposition, which is less of a defense, but I'm going to transpose some of her terms into Stieglerese, Bernard Stieglerese. And in so doing, I'm going to try to give what I think is the best possible version of this argument. So I guess in that sense, I'm advocating for her, but I don't know. We'll see. I do this transition at this time because I'm connecting to a word you just used about intimacy, because that's clear. This idea that music seems to naturally, organically call forth or elicit this kind of intimate response. That's obviously kind of key to her, to her understanding of music and to her kind of phenomenology in music. It's also what she worries, in a word or two, it's what she worries that streaming music, through its omnipresence and its sheer convenience, kind of dulls. It dulls our intimacy. The convenience and easy use tends to is a block against or deters us from having hinders our more intimate relationship with music. So what if I'll try and translate this just Stiegler's terms, in particular using the term of tertiary, Stiegler's term, tertiary retention. Now, it's a complex concept, but I'll try and do a shorthand version of it. Tertiary retention, basically in Stiegler, stands for the tools we use to enable us to remember things. And this is part of Stiegler's major argument, that tools are kind of, this is one way in which he equates or correlates with everyone's favorite Bruno Latour, in that for Stiegler, technological is not external to the human. It actually helps create the human. And it creates the human because most of our tools are memory, if they're not tertiary, they're tertiary retentions, which means they're memory keepers, in the sense that, in a very broad sense, the hammer stands for a kind of know-how, right? it's a tool that at the one and the same time also it's a material manifestation of human memory. Like, this is a tool that allowed humans to do this in the past. And when you hold that hammer, you're in that longer lineage of human accomplishment that you don't have to remember because the tool is there doing the remembering for you. Is that a fair, so I'm trying to underscore and illuminate the close proximity between tools, these material objects, and something that's on our insides,
Right.
memories, our cognitive capacities. So, and that's another important aspect of tertiary retention for Stiegler, that in a way, tools are not, they retain memory, but it's not a retention of memory on the individual level merely. It's a retention of the collective memory, right? It's a collective memory device. Okay. Did I do okay with that? Do you have anything you want to add?
I want to see where you're going with this, because there's an interesting sort of paradox in her position that speaks to this. So,
okay, well, I was going to get away from Stiegler now and go to Lu. And so to your point.
Okay.
Lu's version of tertiary retention, the collective memory device that is giving her problems, in this case, the collective memory device, the tertiary retention that she's struggling with, is the archive, is the musical archive as embodied in YouTube, or more particularly in the massive online music libraries of Spotify or any of these music streaming platforms. Okay. It seems that the very existence of the tertiary retention of the archive is one of the things that gets in the way of that she feels blocks our memories, or it in weird, for her, the tertiary retention is never really a tertiary retention, because in order to remember, in her view, in order to truly remember, you have to have you have to have contributed to the archive. You don't participate in the archive. You don't use the archive. You had to have built the archive. So she has this really kind of substantial concern with the archive. And what I think she's trying to do here, now it may be foolishly ambitious, but it's a question about whether or not the wish is foolish. What she seems to want to do is replace the tertiary retention device of Spotify with acts of individual collecting or hoarding or gathering, right? And she feels that act of gathering now that's a tool too.
I was going to say the problem here, the contradiction, and you're right. I think she is resisting. So the tertiary retentions are memories that are technologically aided or enabled. And the thing about it, right, is that they extend.
It's impersonal. It's impersonal. How could it be intimate? It's impersonal.
It's impersonal, but beyond being impersonal, they're like extra personal, right? It extends well beyond our own experiences.
Capacities, yeah.
Right. So there's the contradiction there, because while she's very much not comfortable with that, what is the music on her computer other than a tertiary retention? These are technologically enabled. And when we're talking about this, I think you and I are thinking about this. And I think that the sort of lazy way of approaching this, not calling you lazy, but is to think about tertiary retentions as digital things. But this gets us all the way back to Adorno with his dislike of the phonograph, right? Where, well, at least this technological intervention saves music from the people who are trying to ruin the theater. So we have that, right? So, but music is always technologically enabled, right? Like the recorded music is always going to be anything other than the live show is going to be a tertiary retention. But when we think of this in terms of MP3s and streaming music and an archive that is held on Spotify servers versus an archive that sits on our own personal hard drives, I'm just the difference here seems to be rooted in some sort of agency where she's able to say,
yes, the agency of collecting. I think it's very much right.
Choice, right? I chose to hear this song rather than you playing it for me, regardless of whether or not it's the same darn song.
I think that's a good critique of Lu's position, that she ironically seems to be putting a lot of burden on individual agency. I bought this, I own this, and that shows it's significant because I chose to have it. And she refer to it this way? Like, I chose to have this in my personal collection. There's a lot of volition here, a lot of agency, maybe an exaggerated notion of agency. What do you think?
No, I think that's right, because what's the difference between clicking a few times and having music magically appear on your hard drive and clicking a few times and magically having music appear in a playlist for yourself? You know, this, and again, I fully understand. I'm approaching this from a different perspective, but God, I would love to understand this, whether there's some sort of, like, because I've paid for this directly to the artist as opposed to paying Spotify for this or whomever, that is more pure, and then it's a cleaner intimacy.
She is hoping, this is getting back to the point we were making a moment ago, that she's putting a lot of burden on her on acts of consumption and so that she imagines better ways of consuming music. Like, I think she would answer, well, that is a better way to do it. To go to Bandcamp and spend my money in that way is better than, because it is more just toward the musicians, more ethically responsible toward the musical ecology, toward the.
So are we then arguing that intimacy, in order to be legitimate, has to be ethical?
Well, I think that's one of the strands of her argument. Yeah. Now you could say that maybe.
And is something like Spotify somehow unethical? I mean, these are.
There'd be a lot of musicians who do say that, right? Now, to me, I think the complication is she's making this argument that's putting finally too much burden on, or too much philosophical burden on our individual acts and decisions in relation to music. You know, she thinks she has a lot of agency by choosing what she puts in or puts out, or what she discards from her thing.
Let's try this slipper on and see if it fits here.
Yeah.
Because I think maybe I think I may have. So Stiegler talks about amateurism, right? And the idea behind the amateur as opposed to the professional has to do with the love, right? The willingness to do something on your own and away, as opposed to doing something that fits with your station and that is a part of your professional identity. And I wonder if spending money is, as opposed to I wonder if paying for an archive that is smaller, but is, I don't want to say it's more customized, because the customization, like the algorithm will customize for you and it
It's a
learns
different
and it
kind of
gets good.
personal.
But
It's a different kind of it's a different, more intimate kind of personality,
maybe
right?
it's more intimate because of what it isn't,
Yes.
right? And so
Yes.
I wonder if what she's really talking about is establishing this emotional connection with something that is imperfect, that is lacking, but is fully and wholly of your creation, right? And if that's the case, then what we've got is the, I guess the digital version here of an amateur pursuit in Stiegler's terms.
I love that observation. And I especially like your point that I think is really congruent with what Lucy seems to be proposing here. It's actually the imperfections and the gaps
To create the
that
intimacy.
that create the intimacy. So the whole point of it is that it's imperfect and idiosyncratic
Yes.
and not an archive.
So
So the archive is we still have a binary, right? The
yeah.
archive is an impersonal thing. The archive approaches perfection.
Yes, exactly.
The
And
archive fills the whole point. Let's fill in all the gaps.
right. And so this is what we're talking when she's talking about convenience. We're not talking about having to have my phone near me to play it. We're talking about the gaps and the absences that are inconvenient, as in I was unable to get this. And it doesn't have to be much. And that is the digital version of me
I think
reaching
you
into the
hit.
back seat of my car, grabbing the tape case, pulling it out and finding it's empty,
It's
or it's
it's
got the
empty.
wrong tape.
Yeah, yeah. I think here's the thing that she doesn't say it, but I think this is what this is I think you put your finger on the nub here. The nub is that the grounding assumption is that the perfect collection is imperfect. The perfect relation to music is flawed.
Mm-hmm.
There is this hole in it that represents our personality. And if you fill in the hole, you make it more like the archive, you make it more perfect, you fill in the gaps, you erase intimacy, and you erase the personality that she wants to sort of create.
I
So,
like it. I like it.
but do you think it's an exaggeration? Okay, so I think I think that's a good sort of translation of Lu's arguments into the Stiegler lens. I think now we're ready for the wrap up questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do we think about that? Is this an important counter? Is she basically? I'll put it this way, Michael. Here's the final question. She seems to want us all to become amateurs. She wants to become an amateur again, even though, as you also pointed out, she's a digital native and she's more, even though she is resisting it, she knows full well the pleasures and the automatic luxuries of the digital world and of the offered by the algorithm. She's consciously sort of retreating from that. But and she wants to recover the world of the amateur, the emotional world of the amateur's appreciation of music in a professionalized age.
Here's the thing.
So do we buy it? Do we buy it?
Under certain circumstances, I think we do. I suspect that this argument that she's made here falls apart if you listen to bubblegum pop music, if you listen to whatever is being stuffed down your throat. This falls apart because the music that is just truly ubiquitous problematizes her position here, right? If it's everywhere all the time, then this question
Then
of
it better be
intimacy,
on streaming. It
right?
better be on
Then you
streaming.
have, but I suspect that this idea, because that will always be perfect. It will always be readily available for you because that is music that exists solely to be consumed on a massive scale. If, however, you have a collection that is legitimately imperfect, if you have an archive, personal archive that is inconvenient, that has holes that you cannot fix with a simple click, then I think that you do have intimacy, because what I'm taking from this is that intimacy, and I think this was one of the questions we started with, right? Convenience versus engagement, right? If you, and I'm assuming that we're talking about engagement as a parallel term to intimacy. If you have a perfect archive, then it's very difficult to have this intimacy because there's no lack, there's no wanting, right? Whereas if you have these holes, then the physicality is irrelevant. I still struggle with the difference between listening to music that I technically own versus listening to music that I'm technically borrowing. I don't understand that. But in terms, and other than just saying, look, I'm going to remove myself from the algorithm entirely. And that's what she's done, right? She says, I don't listen to streaming music. So if you can somehow wall yourself off from that, then I get it. And I think this works. I don't think ownership matters, because then my concern is irrelevant, because there is no listening to music that you don't own. And I think that's her point, right? She's like, I don't indulge in this. I don't have
I
an
don't
either
want,
or.
yeah, yeah. I don't know what I think of this position because,
I just don't understand why you would do that to yourself, though.
well, I think what she's doing is speaking for an, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure how I relate to this argument. The thing that I find most powerfully relatable about her argument is is something that she doesn't fully articulate, which is this idea that you need material stuff to build memories. But she doesn't really land in that argument or maintain that argument. So I'm not sure exactly what to do with some of the other bits of her argument. I would say this, though. I think the anxieties that I think that consciously or no, and I think she actually is very conscious of it. I would say consciously, she is drawing attentions to some anxieties that probably, like you said, they don't bother the pop music listener,
Mm-mm.
where ease and convenience really have to be the main criteria, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ease and convenience, and also freeness, right? It's free, all those things. But any listener who styles themselves, and she does, as a kind of sophisticated, not naive, serious listener, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, there is a question of what to do with the fact that we have these technological means of technological retention, of tertiary retention, that preserve everything, which we've never had these tools with this power and capacity before. And it does, I think it unnerves anybody who has tastes that are not merely popular tastes. I think it
Mm-hmm.
makes everybody nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what she's expressing. And she's fair. I was about to say she's doing it unconsciously, but she is fairly conscious about it. And insofar, I think that it's explaining the other tendency in this essay. I think you see a lot of conflicting tendencies. One of them you see is this idea that you sense that what she would really like to do is get away from the algorithm entirely. But
Yes.
as you point out, she doesn't go there.
Mm-mm.
But you can sense like a lot of unresolved tensions and anxieties here, that that's one big one. The YouTube,
You know what it
Spotify,
is? You know what it might
yeah,
be?
is
The
one of them.
difference between Spotify and YouTube is that with something like YouTube, you still have to go down the rabbit hole on your own. you have a measure of control in choosing to click here versus there, as opposed to simply being led. Ultimately, I think that her march towards intimacy is absolutely tied up in agency. That if you are fed something, it is not intimate. You have to have some sort of active role in this. And I think that's her argument.
Well put. That's what I was trying to say earlier when I was mentioning, and I didn't articulate it as well as you did, this idea that she's putting a lot of privilege and purpose in her acts of consumption and her choices.
Yeah. And that's it. And I think that's really tantamount to intimacy here.
Yeah.
Well, very nicely done, sir.
Well,
as
we
always,
congratulate ourselves, but what do our listeners think? So,
yeah, well,
post, tell us. Tell us what
absolutely.
side you're on. Are you on the side of the archive?
Well, we're all
Or
on
do
the
you want
side
to
of
get
the archive. It's how you dance with the archive,
Yeah, it's
really.
how you dance. Yeah.
Barry, thank you. This was good. I enjoyed it. And I
Thank
look
you,
forward to
Michael.
next time.
Thank you, Michael. Me too.
All right.
See you
Take
soon.
care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.